The boardroom felt like a courtroom as the executives stared at the failed $20 million deal. My boss, Vin Harding, pointed his finger directly at me with theatrical disgust. "She missed critical details in the contract review," he declared, his voice dripping with false authority. "This disaster is entirely on her shoulders." I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the cold stares around the mahogany table told me everything. They had already decided. Vin had spun his story first, painting me as the scapegoat while positioning himself as the victim of my incompetence. My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. "The client specifically mentioned concerns about Clause 7, Vin continued, his lie flowing smoothly. "I trusted her expertise, and she assured me everything was handled." The irony burned in my throat. I had flagged Clause 7 weeks ago in an email that Vin himself had dismissed, but nobody asked for my side. Nobody wanted to hear it. In that moment, watching Vin's performance, I knew my career at Xylon Industries was over. What I didn't know was that this betrayal would become his biggest mistake. By 5 o'clock that same day, my access badge was deactivated and security escorted me through the lobby. The cardboard box in my arms felt heavier than it should have, filled with 5 years of personal items and shattered trust. Vin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, giving an interview to the trade publication reporter who had arrived within hours of the meeting. "Sometimes tough decisions require strong leadership," I heard him say as I passed. "We've taken swift action to address the oversight." The reporter nodded sympathetically, scribbling notes about Vin's decisive response to the crisis. My stomach churned watching him spin my destruction into his triumph. The elevator doors closed, cutting off his voice but not the sting of his words. I caught my reflection in the polished steel, pale, defeated, carrying my professional life in a box. Other employees avoided eye contact, already having heard the whispers about my supposed failure. Walking to my car in the parking garage, I realized Vin hadn't just fired me. He had crafted a narrative that would follow me wherever I went. This wasn't just termination. It was character assassination. And he was just getting started. Within 2 weeks, Vin was featured on the cover of Industry Weekly as the executive who saved a sinking deal. The article praised his quick thinking and decisive leadership during the crisis. According to the piece, he had identified the problem employee immediately and took corrective action to prevent future disasters. I read every word from my apartment, my coffee growing cold as anger replaced shock. The reporter quoted Vin extensively about his philosophy of accountability and how leaders must make hard choices. He even got emotional talking about how difficult it was to let go of someone he had mentored. The company awarded him a $50,000 performance bonus and additional stock options. His photo appeared in the company newsletter under the headline, "Leadership in Action." Colleagues sent congratulatory messages on his social media posts, praising his handling of the situation. Meanwhile, my phone stayed silent, except for rejection emails from recruiters who had suddenly gone cold. Vin's story was spreading through industry networks, faster than truth could travel. He hadn't just survived the failed deal, he had transformed it into a career-defining moment of leadership excellence. The worst part was watching him believe his own lies. 3 months later, my savings account was nearly empty, and my confidence was completely drained. Every job interview ended the same way. Polite smiles followed by calls that never came. The few recruiters who still spoke to me delivered the same message: concerns about my reliability and attention to detail. "I heard about the Xylon situation," one recruiter said carefully during a phone call. "The feedback is that you might not be ready for this level of responsibility." I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, but Vin's version had become accepted fact across the industry. My apartment felt smaller each day as bills piled up and opportunities disappeared. Friends stopped calling after my constant complaints about the injustice became exhausting. Family members suggested I consider a career change, convinced that maybe Vin's story contained some truth. Late at night, I would replay that boardroom scene over and over, thinking about what I could have said differently. But the real torture was knowing that somewhere across town, Vin was sleeping peacefully in his promotion-funded luxury condo while I stress-ate cereal for dinner. The isolation was crushing. But it was also clarifying. I began to understand that playing by the rules had made me vulnerable to someone who refused to play by any rules at all. 6 months after my firing, I was organizing my home office when I found it, a flash drive containing backup files from my Xylon computer. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop, not expecting much, but there it was, the complete email thread about the failed deal, including Vin's explicit approval of the problematic contract terms. The timestamp was clear. 2 weeks before the client meeting, I had sent Vin a detailed analysis highlighting the risks in Clause 7. His response was equally clear. Stop overthinking this. The client wants to move fast and we need this deal closed. Proceed as planned. I stared at the screen, my heart racing as the implications sank in. Vin hadn't just lied about my involvement. He had actively overruled my warnings to meet his quarterly targets. The failed deal wasn't my oversight. It was his calculated gamble that backfired. For the first time in months, I felt something besides despair. The emotion was sharp and focused, cutting through the fog of self-doubt that had consumed me. Vin had destroyed my career based on a lie, but he had made one crucial mistake. He assumed I wouldn't fight back. As I saved copies of the emails to multiple locations, I realized my real education was just beginning. I spent the next month carefully reviewing every document on that flash drive, treating it like an archaeological dig through Vin's career. What I found was a pattern of calculated deception that went far beyond our failed deal. Email chains showed him taking credit for subordinates' work, expense reports revealing company funds used for personal luxuries, and meeting notes where he promised clients services he knew couldn't be delivered. The most damaging discovery was a series of late-night approvals Vin had made on projects flagged by the compliance team. He had repeatedly overridden safety concerns and regulatory warnings to meet deadlines, leaving a paper trail of reckless decisions that put the company at serious risk. I created a secure folder system, organizing everything chronologically and by category. Each document was cross-referenced and verified, building an irrefutable case against the man who had positioned himself as a model executive. The evidence painted a picture of someone who achieved success by pushing risk onto others while claiming credit for their work. But having proof wasn't enough. I needed a strategy that would expose Vin's true nature without making me look like a vengeful ex-employee. The business world rewarded winners and dismissed losers, so I had to change the narrative before I could change my circumstances. As I planned my next move, one thought kept me focused. Vin's career was built on lies. And lies, eventually, always collapse under their own weight. My breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Lawrence Xylon, a former colleague who had been mysteriously fired 3 months before my own termination. I found him working at a coffee shop downtown, his engineering degree apparently worthless after Vin branded him as difficult to manage in his personnel file. "You want to know the truth about Vin?" Lawrence asked bitterly when I approached him. "He's been covering up safety violations for 2 years. I reported a structural flaw in the Riverside project, and instead of fixing it, he buried my report and got me fired for creating unnecessary delays." Lawrence's story aligned perfectly with the documents I had found. He still had copies of his safety assessments and Vin's emails instructing him to find creative solutions instead of proper fixes. The Riverside project had been Vin's major success story, earning him recognition and bonuses while hiding potentially dangerous shortcuts. The worst part, Lawrence continued, is that he manipulated the harassment complaint system too. When Sarah from accounting tried to report his inappropriate comments, Vin convinced HR she was being vindictive after her project got reassigned. She left the company rather than fight it. By the end of our conversation, I realized Vin's pattern of betrayal went back years. I wasn't his first victim. I was just his most recent one. But unlike his previous targets, I had documentation, contacts, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. Lawrence looked at me with something approaching hope. "Are you planning to do something about this?" Instead of rushing into action, I spent 3 months studying Vin's network and building my own. I created detailed profiles of every board member, investor, and business partner connected to Xylon Industries. I researched their backgrounds, their priorities, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities to scandal. Vin's success was built on relationships with people who valued reputation above everything else. His biggest supporters were conservative investors who had built their careers on trust and reliability. They had backed Vin because they believed his carefully crafted image of principled leadership. I also mapped out the media landscape, identifying reporters who covered corporate accountability stories and bloggers who specialized in executive misconduct. Several journalists had been investigating Xylon Industries' unusually high employee turnover, but hadn't found the smoking gun that would make the story worth publishing. During this period, I maintained complete silence about my plans. I took a temporary job at a consulting firm, rebuilding my professional network while carefully positioning myself as someone who had moved on from the Xylon experience. Friends and family believed I was finally healing from the trauma. But every evening, I would return to my apartment and refine my strategy. Vin thought he had destroyed me completely, which made him careless about covering his tracks. His confidence would become his weakness, and my patience would become my weapon. The waiting was agonizing, but it was also necessary. When I finally struck, it would be with precision that left no room for counterattack. The first leak was small and seemingly insignificant, an anonymous tip to Industry Watch blog about irregularities in Vin's expense reports. The blogger, known for exposing corporate waste, published a brief item noting that Xylon Industries executives had charged personal luxury purchases to company accounts during the failed deal crisis. Vin's response was predictably dismissive. Industry gossip and jealous competitors, he told the few reporters who bothered to ask. His confidence was absolute, treating the accusation as beneath his notice. The story gained little traction initially, mentioned only in a few trade publications. But I wasn't looking for immediate impact. I was establishing credibility for the blogger and creating the first crack in Vin's perfect facade. The expense report details were minor compared to what I had planned, but they were completely verifiable. When reporters fact-checked the claims, they found every detail accurate. More importantly, the story introduced the idea that Vin might not be the transparent leader he pretended to be. Board members who had previously dismissed any criticism now had a specific allegation to consider. The seed of doubt was planted. Vin called an all-hands meeting that Friday, reassuring employees that malicious rumors wouldn't distract from their important work. As I watched the live stream from my new office, I couldn't help smiling. He had no idea the earthquake was just beginning. Vin's lawyers moved quickly, sending cease and desist letters to the blogger and demanding Xylon Industries' legal department investigate the source of the leak. The aggressive response actually drew more attention to the story, with several business reporters noting the unusually strong reaction to what seemed like a minor allegation. I received no direct contact, but I knew Vin suspected me. Former colleagues mentioned that he had been asking questions about my current activities and whether anyone had maintained contact with me. His paranoia was showing, which meant my strategy was working. The legal threats backfired spectacularly when the blogger published Vin's cease and desist letter, highlighting the contrast between his public dismissal of the claims and his private efforts to suppress them. If the allegations are false, the blogger wrote, why the expensive legal team? Vin's next mistake was calling in favors to pressure the blogger's other sources, hoping to isolate the story. But his heavy-handed tactics only convinced more people that he was hiding something significant. Industry insiders began speculating about what other secrets might be worth such an aggressive cover-up attempt. I watched Vin's panic from a safe distance, knowing that his own reactions were becoming part of the story. He was fighting shadows while I remained completely invisible, pulling strings he couldn't even see. The beautiful irony was that his attempts to protect himself were making him look more guilty with each passing day. 2 weeks later, I released the real ammunition. Detailed financial records showing Vin had systematically misused company funds for personal expenses over 18 months. The documentation was irrefutable. Hotel suites for family vacations charged as client meetings, personal shopping trips disguised as business entertainment, even his daughter's college tuition hidden in a training budget. This time, major business publications picked up the story immediately. The amounts were significant enough to warrant serious investigation, and the paper trail was too comprehensive to dismiss as accounting errors. Vin's face appeared on the evening business news for the first time since his triumphant post-firing interviews. His response was more measured this time, probably coached by expensive crisis management consultants. He claimed the expenses were legitimate business costs that had been mischaracterized by someone with an agenda. But the specificity of the records made his explanation sound hollow and desperate. Xylon Industries' stock price dropped 3% on the news, wiping millions from the company's market value. Board members who had previously supported Vin unconditionally began asking uncomfortable questions about financial controls and executive oversight. The beauty of this revelation was its timing. It came just as Vin was preparing to present the quarterly results to investors. Instead of celebrating his leadership success, he would spend the next week defending his expense account to auditors and reporters. Vin attempted to regain control by calling an emergency company-wide meeting, projecting confidence while addressing what he called baseless attacks on our leadership. I watched the live stream from my office, studying his body language as he tried to reassure employees and stakeholders that the allegations were merely distractions from their continued success. But I had timed my next revelation perfectly. As Vin spoke about transparency and accountability, reporters were already receiving advance copies of the documents that would destroy his credibility forever. Internal safety reports from the Riverside project showing that Vin had personally approved construction shortcuts that violated building codes. The safety violations weren't just financial misconduct. They represented potential danger to public welfare. Vin had prioritized project deadlines over structural integrity, overruling his own engineers to meet quarterly targets. The documents showed a pattern of reckless endangerment disguised as decisive leadership. By the time Vin finished his reassuring speech, phones were buzzing throughout the audience as news alerts pushed the safety story to industry professionals. His confident smile faltered as he noticed the distractions spreading through the room like wildfire. The transition from financial impropriety to public safety violations transformed Vin from a potentially corrupt executive to a genuinely dangerous one. His carefully managed image was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing his lawyers or consultants could do to stop it. The breakthrough I had been waiting for came in the form of a recorded phone conversation that landed in my secure email inbox. Vin, unaware he was being recorded, had called his former lieutenant to vent about the mounting pressure from the safety violations story. She was supposed to take the fall for everything. Vin's voice was clear on the recording. I set up that deal failure perfectly. Pin it all on her incompetence and move on. But now she's somehow fighting back, and I don't understand how she could have this level of inside information. The recording was a complete confession, admitting not only that he had framed me for the failed deal, but that he had planned my destruction from the beginning. His voice carried no remorse, only frustration that his scheme hadn't eliminated me permanently from the industry. The source of the recording remained anonymous, but I suspected it came from someone inside Xylon Industries who had grown tired of Vin's manipulative leadership style. The conversation revealed his true character: calculating, remorseless, and willing to destroy careers to protect his own interests. I sat in my apartment that night, listening to Vin's words over and over, feeling a cold satisfaction wash over me. He had inadvertently provided the evidence that would not only clear my name, but expose him as the architect of my professional assassination. His arrogance had finally trapped him. I delivered the recorded confession to Xylon Industries' board of directors through an anonymous package, accompanied by a detailed timeline connecting Vin's admission to the documented evidence of his misconduct. The board had no choice but to take immediate action, launching a formal internal investigation and placing Vin on administrative leave, pending the results. The business press exploded with coverage of the recording, which made Vin's guilt undeniable even to his most loyal supporters. Board members who had stood by him through the expense account and safety violations could no longer ignore the evidence that their star executive was a master manipulator who had built his career on lies. Vin's first instinct was to attack the legitimacy of the recording, claiming it had been doctored by disgruntled former employees. But audio analysis confirmed its authenticity, and the specific details in the conversation matched perfectly with documented events that only Vin would have known. His second mistake was holding an impromptu press conference to deny the allegations, during which he appeared desperate and paranoid. His claims that he was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by jealous competitors and bitter ex-employees made him sound unhinged rather than innocent. For the first time since my firing, I felt the satisfaction of watching Vin experience the helplessness I had lived with for months. The difference was that his panic was justified. Everything he had built was about to collapse. Vin's desperation led him to hire a team of private investigators to dig into my personal life, hoping to find ammunition for a counterattack. Within days, anonymous articles appeared on industry blogs questioning my mental stability and suggesting I had been fired for legitimate performance issues that I was now trying to cover up through a revenge campaign. The smear campaign was professionally executed, but ultimately ineffective because it relied on character assassination rather than factual rebuttal. Vin's team couldn't dispute the documented evidence I had presented, so they attempted to discredit me personally as an unreliable source, motivated by bitterness and professional jealousy. But my months of careful preparation had anticipated this response. I had built relationships with credible sources and maintained a professional reputation at my new consulting position. When reporters fact-checked Vin's claims about my character and performance, they found a consistent pattern of colleagues and clients who contradicted his narrative. More importantly, Vin's aggressive investigation into my background only reinforced the impression that he was a vindictive executive who attacked his critics rather than addressing their legitimate concerns. His behavior validated every allegation about his character and leadership style. The private investigation backfired spectacularly when one of Vin's hired investigators approached my current employer with false claims about my work history. My boss, who knew the truth about my Xylon Industries experience, immediately contacted reporters about Vin's harassment campaign. The next phase of my campaign focused on the human cost of Vin's leadership style, specifically the employees he had silenced, demoted, or driven out of the company for challenging his decisions. I had spent months quietly building relationships with Vin's victims, documenting their experiences and gathering evidence of systematic workplace misconduct. The most powerful testimony came from women who had experienced Vin's inappropriate behavior but had been too afraid to speak publicly while he held power over their careers. With Vin weakened and under investigation, several former employees agreed to share their stories with reporters who specialized in workplace harassment coverage. Their accounts painted a picture of an executive who used his position to intimidate subordinates and retaliate against anyone who questioned his judgment. Vin's pattern of behavior went far beyond financial misconduct. He had created a toxic workplace culture that protected his interests at the expense of employee welfare and company integrity. The harassment allegations transformed Vin from a potentially corrupt businessman into a predatory boss who had systematically abused his power over vulnerable employees. Major news outlets picked up the story, framing Vin's financial crimes as part of a broader pattern of unethical leadership. Xylon Industries board accelerated their investigation and began reaching out to former employees, trying to assess the full scope of Vin's misconduct before shareholders and regulators demanded answers they couldn't provide. The cascading revelations created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond Vin himself to the board members who had enabled his behavior. Investors began questioning how Xylon Industries' leadership could have remained unaware of such extensive misconduct, especially when the warning signs had been documented for years. 3 board members announced their resignations within a week, citing their failure to provide adequate oversight of executive behavior. Their departure triggered a broader examination of corporate governance at Xylon Industries, with regulatory agencies opening formal investigations into the company's compliance and reporting practices. Vin's closest allies began distancing themselves as quickly as possible, refusing to take his calls and avoiding any association with his crisis. Former mentors and collaborators published statements expressing shock at the allegations and emphasizing their limited knowledge of his activities. The isolation was complete and devastating. Vin had spent his career building a network of relationships based on mutual benefit and shared success, but when those relationships became liabilities, they evaporated immediately. He discovered that loyalty purchased with favors disappeared the moment the favors stopped flowing. I watched from my new position as Vin's empire collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The man who had built his reputation on strong relationships and principled leadership found himself abandoned by everyone who had once claimed to respect his judgment and character. In a final desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Vin agreed to an exclusive interview with a prominent business journalist, hoping to control the narrative and present his side of the story. His media consultants probably believed they could rehabilitate his image through a carefully staged confession and apology tour. But I had been preparing for this moment since the beginning of my campaign. The night before Vin's interview aired, I released my most damaging evidence yet, documentation of offshore accounts connected to Vin that contained unexplained deposits totaling over $2 million. Payments that coincided with major Xylon Industries contracts. The timing was perfect. Vin's interview, which was supposed to focus on his leadership philosophy and response to recent allegations, was completely derailed when the journalist confronted him with evidence of potential bribery and money laundering. His prepared talking points became irrelevant when faced with questions about criminal conduct. Vin's performance during the interview was catastrophic. He stumbled through non-answers, contradicted himself repeatedly, and eventually stormed out when the questioning became too aggressive. The footage of his meltdown went viral within hours, cementing his transformation from respected executive to industry pariah. The interview that was supposed to save his career instead provided the definitive evidence that Vin was guilty of everything his accusers claimed and more. Federal investigators moved swiftly once the offshore account evidence became public. Within 48 hours, they had obtained warrants to search Vin's home, office, and financial records. The raids were covered extensively by news media, with helicopter footage showing agents carrying boxes of documents from his luxury penthouse. I watched the coverage from my office, feeling a satisfaction that was both profound and unexpected. The man who had destroyed my career with lies and manipulation was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But more importantly, his victims were finally being vindicated by an investigation that would uncover the truth he had spent years concealing. Vin's arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering made national news. The industry that had once celebrated his leadership success now dissected every aspect of his career, looking for warning signs they had missed and mistakes they had enabled. Xylon Industries' stock price collapsed as investors fled, wiping out billions in shareholder value. The company that Vin had claimed to serve so effectively was now fighting for survival because of his criminal conduct. His legacy was complete destruction rather than the lasting success he had always craved. But for me, watching Vin led away in handcuffs represented something more important than revenge. It was validation that truth eventually triumphs over deception, and that victims of powerful people aren't powerless if they're patient and strategic enough to fight back effectively. The media coverage of Vin's arrest included detailed reporting on the case that had originally led to my firing, the failed $20 million deal that Vin had used to destroy my reputation. Reporters had finally discovered the email evidence showing that I had warned against the contract problems Vin chose to ignore. Industry publications ran correction stories acknowledging that their previous reporting had been based on false information provided by Vin. Several journalists who had written glowing profiles of his leadership published follow-up pieces examining how they had been manipulated by his carefully crafted narrative. More importantly, executives across the industry began reaching out to me directly, offering job opportunities and consulting contracts. My reputation was not only restored but enhanced by the revelation that I had been one of Vin's earliest victims and had eventually played a crucial role in exposing his crimes. The irony was perfect. Vin's attempt to destroy my career had ultimately made me more valuable to employers who now saw me as someone with the integrity to stand up to corruption and the intelligence to document it properly. His betrayal had backfired completely. I accepted a senior position at Xylon Industries' biggest competitor, joining their leadership team with a mandate to implement the ethical standards and compliance procedures that might have prevented Vin's crimes. My first meeting was scheduled for the same day Vin's trial was set to begin. Vin's trial became a public reckoning not just for his crimes but for the culture of executive misconduct that had enabled them. I testified as a key witness, finally able to tell the complete story of how Vin had framed me to cover up his own failures and protect his fraudulent career. My testimony was devastating to Vin's defense strategy, which had relied on portraying him as a hard-working executive whose success had made him a target for jealous competitors and disgruntled former employees. The documented evidence I provided proved that Vin's pattern of deception went back years and had destroyed multiple careers. The prosecutor used my case as the foundation for a broader narrative about Vin's character, showing how his willingness to sacrifice innocent people to protect himself was consistent with his financial crimes and workplace misconduct. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same theme. Vin was a predator who had used his position to exploit others for personal gain. Vin's lawyers attempted to discredit me during cross-examination, but their attacks only highlighted the strength of my documentation and the credibility of my account. When they suggested I was motivated by revenge, I calmly explained that I was motivated by truth and accountability. The jury's verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Vin's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but his conviction was already complete vindication for everyone he had wronged during his rise to power. Vin's sentencing marked the end of a career that had once seemed unstoppable. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $15 million in restitution to Xylon Industries and the victims of his crimes. His assets were frozen and would be liquidated to satisfy the judgment. But the legal consequences were only part of Vin's punishment. His name became synonymous with corporate corruption and executive misconduct in business schools and professional development programs. Case studies of his crimes were used to teach future leaders about the importance of ethical behavior and proper governance. Industry associations removed Vin's name from awards and honors he had received during his fraudulent career. His photographs were taken down from Xylon Industries' offices and replaced with reminders about the company's commitment to ethical leadership and employee protection. The transformation was complete. Vin had gone from celebrated executive to cautionary tale in less than 2 years. His ambition to build a lasting legacy had been fulfilled, but not in the way he had intended. He would be remembered as an example of how corporate power could corrupt and how deception eventually destroys its practitioners. For his victims, Vin's downfall represented something more valuable than revenge. It was proof that justice was possible, even when the system seemed rigged in favor of the powerful and well-connected. My own career flourished in ways I had never imagined possible before Vin's betrayal. The consulting firm I had joined promoted me to partner after our first year working together, recognizing both my technical expertise and my unique understanding of corporate governance and compliance issues. I specialized in helping companies investigate and address executive misconduct, using the skills I had developed during my campaign against Vin to protect other organizations from similar corruption. My reputation for thorough investigation and ethical leadership made me highly sought after by boards and investors. The financial success was substantial, but the professional satisfaction was even more meaningful. I was finally able to do the kind of work I had always wanted, using my analytical abilities to solve complex problems and protect people from predatory behavior. Vin's attempt to end my career had inadvertently launched a better one. Xylon Industries offered me Vin's former position, but I declined. I had no interest in returning to a company that had enabled his behavior for so long, even though new leadership had implemented the reforms necessary to prevent future misconduct. Instead, I built my own practice focused on corporate accountability and whistleblower protection. My first client was a former Xylon Industries employee who had been retaliated against for reporting safety violations. The cycle of justice was continuing, and I was proud to be part of it. Years later, I established a foundation dedicated to supporting employees who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct or challenging unethical leadership. The Vin Harding Foundation for Workplace Justice provided legal assistance, financial support, and career counseling to whistleblowers and other victims of corporate abuse. The foundation's work attracted national attention and additional funding from other business leaders who had experienced similar challenges during their careers. We created a network of support that made it easier for honest employees to speak truth to power without sacrificing their livelihoods. Vin himself became an involuntary symbol of the Foundation's mission. His case was featured in our educational materials and training programs, demonstrating both the tactics that corrupt executives use to silence their critics and the strategies that victims can employ to fight back effectively. The irony was fitting. Vin's name would forever be associated with the cause he had tried to destroy. His legacy was not the successful career he had built through deception and manipulation, but the movement for accountability and justice that had grown from the ruins of his crimes. I spoke regularly at conferences and universities about corporate ethics and employee rights, sharing my story as an example of how persistence and preparation could overcome even the most powerful opposition. Vin's betrayal had taught me lessons about resilience and justice that I was honored to pass on to others. Today, I stood outside the federal courthouse where Vin's trial had taken place 3 years earlier. Through the window, I could see him being led to a transport vehicle, his prison uniform a stark contrast to the designer suits he had worn during his years of success. He looked older, grayer, diminished by the consequences of his choices. Our eyes met for just a moment as he was guided toward the van. I felt no anger, no satisfaction in his suffering, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served. Vin had sold me out to save himself, but in the end, his betrayal had destroyed him while setting me free. He had taught me that the business world could be ruthless and that trust could be weaponized by those willing to abandon their principles for personal gain. But he had also shown me that patience, preparation, and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Vin disappeared into the van that would take him back to prison, where he would serve the remainder of his sentence. I walked away from the courthouse toward my car, where my assistant was waiting with updates on our latest case, another executive who thought his position made him untouchable. The cycle continued, but now I was on the right side of it. Vin Harding had tried to end my story, but instead he had given me the beginning of a much better one. And that was the most perfect revenge of all.